Hello, hello, 'tis I, Julian Greystoke, your favorite indie author. Welcome back, friends, to another writing tips video. If you are new here, hi, I'm Julian Greystoke. I write books, if you couldn't tell, and also I am a developmental editor, so I have a bit of experience with the writing world. And so I figured I would come in here and share some more tips that I have for you. If you're writing a book, if you're struggling with writing a book, maybe some of these tips will help you. Today I'm going to be giving tips on giving your characters powers. So especially if you're writing something that is fantasy, science fiction, science fantasy, whatever it is, you want a character who's got some powers and abilities, but also you still want them to remain engaging and not so overpowered that they just win every fight that they're in, every situation that they're in, they just would win it because they have powers. The other thing you want to avoid, probably, is the dreaded giving your character lots of powers and then spending the entire book figuring out reasons why they wouldn't use them. So hopefully some of my tips will help you today when you are writing your characters with powers. As I always say, I am not the god of writing. So these are just tips, and you can feel free to use whatever will work for you and discard whatever doesn't. And you'll probably not be able to use all of these tips in a single book. So just listen, see what resonates, and go from there. So the first thing to consider when giving your characters powers is pretty obvious, and that is consider the world and the world building. What kind of world have you created? If you have created a world where lots of people have powers, it would be less weird for your main character to also have powers. And then you get to decide, are their powers more normal or are their powers more special and never seen before? Keep in mind that we are pretty oversaturated with characters who have never seen before powers. That's not to say that you can't write that, obviously, but know that you'll be going into a market that is already flooded with that kind of character. So finding your own ways to make that interesting is going to be your friend, but let's think about the world that they are living in. Another classic thing to do, of course, is to have people with powers and people without powers and those dynamics within the world building. One thing I really prefer to explore is the way that people who have powers would probably be in charge and put themselves above others. But you often see it where the people who have powers are the ones who are trod upon, because having powers is often used as a metaphor for something else. So for example, queerness. Powers are often very commonly a metaphor for queerness in books, but also there's simple things like just being an outcast or an outsider. It can feel very empowering, if you will, to find out that the outcasts and outsiders in this world are the special ones. And odds are good that your reader will have, at least some point in their life, felt like an outcast or an outsider, so they're going to want to relate to the people with the powers.
I touched on it a little bit already, but also something you think about is how well known the powers are in the world. For example, there are many, many worlds, especially in like urban fantasy, where the magical world is separate from the ordinary human world, and there's a lot of fun stuff to figure out there with how powers affect the main character's life as they negotiate either both worlds, one world, dealing with all of that and the cultures of those places.
But think about your world, how these powers would affect your world and the world building that you've already got planned, or use those powers to bounce off of when creating your world building, depending on what order you like to do things. Next up, I'm going to recommend that your powers have a price. Characters who can just use powers willy-nilly without any restrictions are not fun characters to read about. And also, it's a whole lot harder to figure out how or why your character wouldn't use their super uber powers in a moment when they would if there's no price for them. The price can be hugely different depending on what you want to do. There's all kinds of ideas as far as that goes. A classic one is simple. Magic is draining, physically draining. A lot of people lean on that one, but there's a whole bunch of other things that you could do with it. Sometimes there are items that need to be held in order to perform magic. Sometimes the person will need to be in a certain state to perform magic. Sometimes there have to be consumables involved. All kinds of things that could limit the powers that your character has, because trust me, you are going to need to give them some kind of limit. Now let's say you're creating a character and they are too powerful, whether it is your main character or perhaps it is the villain, and in a situation you need them to not just win everything. How do you nerf a character that maybe is a little bit too powerful for the situation? Here are some ways. For one thing, they can be limited culturally. Perhaps within their culture, it is very much not okay to use their powers willy-nilly, and they will have some sort of cultural backlash for doing so. There's also rarity of the powers. If you were worried about a power being too badass, make it super, super rare. So maybe the character never will have to encounter it, or at least not very often. Difficulty of the powers, we talked about this with limitations. Is this super uber power actually very hard to use and takes a long time to master? That would definitely keep your character from using these powers too much. Something else to consider is, how did the character obtain these powers? Were they born with them? Do the powers manifest at coming of age, which is a very, very common one, is for powers to manifest when a person reaches a certain age. Did the person earn these powers? That's not one I see very often, where they will have to go out and perhaps do a series of tasks to earn the power. Did they have to learn them from books? Do they have to go to school and study to gain the powers? So also definitely something to think about.
And of course, if you're writing a superhero story especially, never forget about the powers of an industrial accident to give your characters supernatural abilities.
Just giving it to the character for free is probably the least fun way of doing it, but it is something we see a lot. And then that character usually has to go through some type of educational hurdles to get good at using that power. Now, something to watch out for is power creep. Especially if you're writing a series, it can be tempting to give your characters new and cooler powers as often as possible. And very often in a series, we will see a main character getting more and more powerful at the end of every book, until by the very end, they are godlike. And unfortunately, that's not a very interesting character to read. We want to see a character who could lose and who could fail, and if they have godlike powers by the end, we're not worried about them. They'll be fine. A great example of some atrocious power creep is in the Lightlark book series, where the main character just keeps getting more and more and more powers, until by the end of the current book that is out, Skyshade, she is basically godlike, and we don't have to ever worry that she could lose in any scenario. One thing I wanted to talk about, which kind of also comes up in that series, is your character should use the powers you have given them. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're spending more time in your book finding reasons for your characters not to use the powers that you gave them, maybe it's time to rethink either your plot or the powers you've given your characters. If you spend all your time, which is what happens in most of the Lightlark books, making sure your characters are powerless in some way, then why did you give them powers to begin with? Yes, there are certain situations where you're not going to want them to use their powers, but if it's happening throughout your whole book, then maybe you've given them the wrong powers, the world building isn't working, something isn't working, and you need to go back and look at the fundamentals to figure out ways that you can have your character using the powers that you gave them. I do have one specific power down here as one to watch out for. There are many, and I think I'll add another one after this one, but teleportation. I have read many books where characters have powers, and the power that they have is teleportation. And the author does not realize, I don't think, when giving the character this power, how ridiculously OP it is. So if you are thinking, what's a power that's not too crazy that I could give my character? I know, teleportation. Think again. A character could be basically unstoppable in a fight, impossible to capture, and a whole host of other issues if they can teleport. So consider not giving them teleportation powers or severely limiting the teleportation powers. A very common limit on teleportation powers is the character cannot teleport anywhere they have not been or cannot see, but that still does not stop you from having the issue of why don't they win every fight they're in, because they could just literally be bouncing around everywhere, appearing behind the enemy, stabbing them, and then teleporting away. The other power that is hard to work around is healing, a magical healing of some kind, and that's why you see that one limited a lot in stories. Something I did in my book Adventurer Mage, I thought I had a copy hanging around, but I don't. Something I did in my book Adventurer Mage where there is healing magic is I made it both very rare of an ability, and also I played with it culturally. So within their culture, being a healer is considered kind of like an uncool power, a undesirable power. And so a lot of people with healing powers just kind of fade into the background. They're not super sought after. Because powers can be genetic, people are not trying to have babies who have healing powers because everybody wants like the big flashy powers like fire and that sort of thing. And so culturally, there's also less healers because people avoid them. So look for ways to also limit your healers. A really common one is also that magic takes a toll, and so the healer cannot heal just anything because it will take a toll on them physically, or just limitations in general on what they can heal and how the healing works. For example, is it the kind of healing where if somebody's arm gets chopped off, the healer can put the arm back on? Or is it the kind of healing where they can't? Is the magical healing able to bring people back from the dead or not? Those are all important things to know about your healing magic, but healing magic can be something to be careful with because if your reader never has to worry about characters getting injured because they'll just immediately be healed, yeah, that's not really working. And finally, I have it is okay not to have your main character be the most powerful one. I know it can be so tempting, especially with a long series, to have your character keep growing and growing until they are the most powerful anything in their world. But remember that we can still love and enjoy characters who maybe have cool powers, but are not the chosen one, the most special. There are plenty of stories like that, and I'm not saying you can't do it. But if you're feeling intimidated by your character being so powerful, it's okay to give them limitations, and it's definitely okay to let them struggle. Struggling is an important part of your character growing and being an engaging character to read. Also, it can be really fun if you are playing with a group of characters to give everybody powers that are not OP so that they have to work together, joining their powers to create something better. Those are my tips for writing characters with powers. I hope that this was helpful. I'm sure that you've also thought of some tips that you have gleaned in your own writing journey, so feel free to drop them below. I love going through the comments, and I hope that if you are watching this, you go check out the comments to see if anybody else has anything that they wanted to add. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget that I have a Patreon where you can support me, or I have channel membership. Either one allows you to see videos that are not seen here on the regular channel. And also I make lots of videos here about books and writerly things, so if just writing advice is not your jam, you can check out some of that stuff. And of course, as I mentioned, I am an author and all my books are available now on Amazon, and more will be coming out eventually. If you'd like to check out my developmental editing services, you can find me on Fiverr. All my links are in the doobly-doo. And I will see all of you again next time with whatever it is I happen to be doing next time. Bye!
Just fear me. Love me, do as I say, and I will be your slave.
Okay, so you could do what Jareth suggests, and I'd totally understand if you would, or you could just become a patron on my Patreon, just like all these lovely people, like Corey, Ashley, Bunna, Nemo, Tactical Hot Dog, Haley History Nerd, Stephanie, Rhea, Christina, Cameron, Lady Kragan, Jose, Lunar Muse, AJ, Marshy, Semi-Dark, GK, Scout, Annika, Jen, Gay Tutter, Tina, Laknuga, SB Boots, Martha Baggins, July, Bird Anonymous, Sarah, Kat, 78 Kilograms of Shade, Ingrid, Roma, Pansing Pony, Haley, Sam, Kira, Kohikaro, Mooney, Puttamancer, Kirsten, Bear, Jojo Bookish, Robin, Ursula, Caitlin, KJ, Mufflier, Celia, Alyssa, Deborah, Swamp Goblin Waifu, Sophia, Merween, Kit, Hidden Glade, Light Julie, Patrick, and Sophie, Callison, Vampire Antihero, Shelby, Zaire, Jesper, Rennie, Scribbling Cat, Savvy, Jenny, and Amanda.
You have no power over me.